Have you ever had a run-in with an authority figure in your life? Laughter indicates that must be a yes. Probably like most of you, I've had my share of run-ins with those in authority over me. Sometimes it was because of rebellion in my heart, in my life. Other times, perhaps, it's been because of my conscience toward God, or at least that's what I would like to think. When I was in the Navy, another lifetime ago it seems now, there was a time when the engineering officer summoned me to his stateroom. Not a common occurrence. I had requested to be relieved from my watch station. The submarine was submerged, and the engineer had ordered some people to paint some hot steam valves with high-temperature aluminum paint. And we were out at sea. Very nasty fumes filled the spaces. Painting at sea was a violation of regulations, and so I had asked my supervisor to be relieved from watch. And I explained why. And he called the engineer, and they stopped painting. After I got off watch, I got the summons to the engineer's stateroom. The engineer asked me, he said, there's an inspection team coming when we pull back into port. What are they going to think whenever we pull into port and these valves that are supposed to be painted are not painted? And I said, I don't know. But what are they going to think if I tell them we painted them while we were out at sea? Was I rebelling? Or was I submitting? Years later I was enrolled in Bible college, and there were rules there too. And obeying the rules at the Bible college, believe it or not, put me in situations that were uncomfortable at times. And at other times actually caused me to participate in activities that I thought were just wrong. And eventually I had to decide if I would continue to stay at Bible college and submit and obey the rules, or if I would leave. It wasn't an option to stay and not obey. I knew I had to submit. And so I decided to stay. I tried to submit, but it wasn't easy. And I vocalized concerns about some of the things that bothered me. And as a result of my vocalization about these things, I was not allowed to speak at graduation. And people asked me, why weren't you the speaker at the graduation? And I simply said, because they chose that other guy. And actually, it was within a week or so of graduation that I went to the registrar's office and I asked, am I going to be able to graduate? Because there was such controversy about me raising concerns about some of these issues. Submission is hard. Submission is hard. And it's hard, first of all, because it's not our nature to submit. We are independent and we tend to be rebellious in nature rather than submissive. But even, as Christians, if we get to the point where we have a desire and a heart to submit and we really try to submit, it's hard to submit. Submission becomes even harder when we try to submit, because then we got to figure out exactly what it is to do that is submissive. And then not only that, but sometimes we're under multiple authorities. And to obey the naval regulations was rebelling against the engineer, and to obey the engineer is rebelling against the regulations, and that becomes difficult. In our culture and society, many see submission as a bad thing. And for others of us, it's just confusing. And so today we want to try to clarify what the Bible teaches about submission. And of course we're not going to be able to answer all the questions, but we want to be able to provide a few clarifications about what God says and why it's important and how we please God through submission, because submission is good. So let's read here in Romans chapter 13. We'll begin in verse 1 and read down through verse 10. It says this. It says, "Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore he who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil." Do you want to have no fear of authority? "Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon the one who practices evil. Wherefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For this, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment, it's summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Love therefore is the fulfillment of the law. And we'll stop right there. Submission, the first part of this text talks about submission. And the first thing that we find is that submission to God is required. It's not optional. Now, most of us probably can understand the general idea. Christians are those who submit to God. And foundational to our relationship with God is recognizing that God is God, God has authority, and we are subject to Him. I don't think you can be a Christian without submitting to God. You have to believe. You can't believe. You don't believe if you don't submit. God says, I listen, I hear, I believe, I submit. At least at some minimal level. And so on the other hand of that, a non-Christian is one who does not submit to God. A Christian submits to God. A non-Christian does not submit to God. Whether they recognize God or not. And although we, after becoming Christians, we still consistently struggle with submitting to God, most of us would agree, I think, in theory at least, that we try to submit. Most of the time, most of us try to submit. Whether we're successful or not is then another story. But if God tells us something, and we know that God says something, there is within us this desire to be in submission to God. Although there may be exceptions and there may be struggles with that. And so we're just going to kind of lay aside that idea of and agree that as Christians we submit to God. But where our struggle really comes is submitting to God when God delegates His authority to somebody else. We have a much greater struggle in submitting to those to whom God delegates His authority. And we live in a world, the world is a place that is saturated with God's authority. And submission is expected at every level. We think, I will gladly submit to God, But I'm only going to submit to that boss if. Yeah, if. Say it again, Audrey. If. I'm only going to submit to my husband if. I'll submit to God, but if that man does that one more time, right? I'll gladly submit to God, but I'm only going to submit to the president or pastors or policemen or parents or anyone else if. And so although we embrace submitting to God as a principle, as a rule in our life, those to whom God delegates authority, we put disclaimers on and say, and there's reasons for that. But notice what it says here in verse 1 of Romans 13. It says, let every person, and when it says it this way, it's like a command. It's a plural command. You submit. We don't have an English equivalent of that, but that's what it is. Be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those which exist are established by God. Think of any authority in your life, and what this verse is saying is that authority is there with God's authority because God has given him that authority. No exceptions. And you may be going down a list of people in your life that are in authority over you and say, why would God ever put that person there? Right?
Amen.
Those in authority would not be in a position of authority if God had not put them there. Do you believe that? Well, maybe here, but here's right? Different in our heart than in our head. And we struggle with those in authority over us because sometimes they are bad. They're just bad. They're evil. Bad dictators, bad policemen, bad parents, bad pastors. Sometimes they're stupid. You know, God puts people in relationships, and maybe there's a woman who's very intelligent, very competent, and a man who's just an idiot and can't figure anything out. It happens. But you know, the issue when it comes to authority and submission is not about competency. It's not about qualifications. It's not about moral character or worthiness to be in authority. You don't deserve to be in authority. That may be true from our perspective. There's just one thing that matters. The delegation of God's authority. Who made you boss? Well, if you ask that question and you go to the Bible, the answer is simple. Who made you boss? God made you boss. Oh. Who made you boss? God made you boss. If God delegated authority to someone over me, then this says God expects me to submit to them because I recognize their authority is not based upon their deserving it, but their authority is based upon the fact that God has placed them in authority. And if God has placed them in authority over me, He has placed me under their authority. And God has expectations for them, and God has expectations for me. And His expectations for me are for me independent of whether or not they fulfill their responsibility to God. We don't like this, do we? We don't. I don't like it. I served in the Navy for 6 years. And there were times that they would send us a junior officer to be the officer over the electrical division, which I was first class, leading first, who directed the division. And this guy would come from some academy or somewhere and presume to tell me what to do. I didn't like it. And I'm a bit ashamed to tell you that I didn't always behave properly. And it's only by God's grace that I didn't get thrown into brig at times, I suppose. If God delegated authority to those over us, then He expects us to submit. And we say, well, there's got to be exceptions. Well, what does it say? There is no authority except from God. Do you realize that there is no authority God is the only authority in this world? The president doesn't have any authority apart from that which God has given to him. The husband doesn't have any authority apart from what God... I have no authority apart from what God has given. We don't. God is the only authority. And the authority structure in the world is an extension of who God is. God is a creator. We are the creature. Oh, let's see. Creator-creature relationship. Authority, submission. Right? And by token of being the creator, He created Adam and Eve and He put them in the garden and He says, okay, here's this garden. You can eat from any tree you want, but that one? Oh, wait a minute, what's that all about? Well, that's about God being the authority and the creature being in submission to that. I expect you to be in submission. Satan questioned the authority of God and the need to submit, right? He suggested that to Eve. Did God really say this? Can you really believe that? Is He really in authority? Don't you have authority of your own? Can't you make that decision without somebody telling you what to do? Look at it. It's pretty. It looks good for food. It'll make you wise. You can make this decision on your own. You don't have to figure it out. And she took and she was deceived and she ate and she gave to Adam and he ate, and they did not submit to God in that, did they? Their disobedience was a failure to submit. And we know the consequences of that as sin entered the world, and man was separated from sin, or separated from God because of his sin, and death entered the world, and we live in the world the way the world is today because of that. So God, by token of being a creator, is the authority and the only authority in the world. And there's no authority that exists apart from Him. And as you think about the people in authority over you in your life, they're there because God put them there, and you're under their authority because God put you where you are. And if we fail to submit to the authority, we're failing to submit to God. You say, Pastor, can I get a get out of jail free card or something on this? Get a pass, like submit, accept, and, well, what does it say? Verse 2, therefore who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. God has ordained, that's ordinance. Ordinance is something that has been ordained. God has ordained that this person be an authority and you be under authority. And sometimes the authorities over us we had no choice in. Sometimes we did. God, when He created the man and the woman, He created them in a relationship that had authority in that relationship before sin. Right? At the end of the sixth day, God looked at the creation. He says, this is very good. And as we read about that sixth day of creation, He says, there's the man, I'll create a helper for him. And inherent in the relationship between the man and the woman was this idea of submission to his leadership. That's what a helper is, right? A helper is someone who helps, who assists. And so there is within the very good creation this authority relationship between the man and the woman. And as a result of sin in the world, as we read in Genesis chapter 3, that relationship got tipped upside down, in which the woman was no longer willing to submit, but she would want to rule. And so this rebellion that all of us have in our heart is very specific to relationship between men and women and marriage, and that's part of the curse specifically expressed there in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. And so what do we have here? We have an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-wise God who is the source of all authority in the world. And He gives authority to some and not to others. And every person who lives exists under some authority and is answerable to someone. Our relationship with authorities, some of those are optional and some are not. You know, I was at Bible college and I could have chosen to leave, and then I wouldn't have been under that authority anymore, and then I wouldn't have to do the things that made me feel uncomfortable. When I was in the Navy, though, slightly different situation. And in marriage, it's like, okay, once you make that choice, then that's it. And it's not the same. You can go to a different job, perhaps, but God doesn't desire that we find someone else that we don't want to submit to rather than the one we don't want to submit to now. Okay? So, the first thing about submission is that there is no authority except from God, and God expects us to submit. It's not optional. Well, what is submission, though? What does it mean to submit? You know, some people think that submission is just rolling over, playing dead, and letting whoever wants to roll over you at will and wipe their feet on you, and that's not what it is. Here in Romans 13:2 it says, "He who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God." Submission is basically knowing our place and staying in our place. It comes from, the word there comes from two words, ordered under. And so it has the idea of being under someone else's authority, control, influence. Someone else has the right to tell us what to do or what not to do. And then knowing that to be in order under them. It comes from a military term, if you think of rank and files, columns and rows, that there's a commander and he says, stand there. That's your place. And so submission is, okay, that's my place, that's where I stand. He says, march, you march. He says, backwards, and so forth. It's the idea of being under authority and in order, willingly and cheerfully under authority. You know, not every authority is my authority. Right? Not every authority is your authority. My wife has to submit to her husband according to God, but she doesn't have to submit in the same way to other men. Right? There's a different authorities in the world. We recognize there's legitimate authorities and those who are try to assert authority but are not in a position of authority over us. We hear kids sometimes, "You're not my boss. You can't tell me what to do," right? Sometimes co-workers. And our tendency is to do what we want to do and obey authorities that we agree with. Or if we have to, when we're forced. Because the consequences are so great. But submission is a hard issue. It's an attitude in the heart related to how we see ourselves and how we see God and how we see others. I mean, after all, God created us. Who are we and how do we fit into this world? Well, God is the creator. And He's the source of all authority. He gives some authority. And He puts me here and He puts you there and He puts us in this relationship with one another. And okay. And in those relationships, there's authority. And if there's an authority, then there's expected submission from God. It's not mindless, robotic obedience, but obedience that seeks to understand and comply with the desires of those in authority over us. And it's hard work. It's hard to be in submission, not just because of our natural nature to rebel against authority, but to figure out exactly what is desired and what is the right thing to do. And then there's competing authorities and conflicting authorities. You know, there's state law and there's federal law. And if you live in Washington, you can smoke marijuana according to state law, but not according to federal law. And then there's God's law and human law, and it's legal to do certain things according to human law, but God says it's wrong. And so just because it's legal under some authority, it's not necessarily right. And God's authority is overall. These competing authorities, it's related to some of the stories that I shared about painting the vows and who's the authority, right? And we have debates about constitutional law and actual law and legislation, and oftentimes in those debates our heart is rebellious. We're not really concerned about which one is the authority because we're not really interested in submitting. We're just interested in doing what we want to do. And if we're honest and we admit it, we're not really seeking the truth. We're seeking to find a way to legitimize our rebellion. Or at least that's how my mind works. You work for a company, you have an employer, and you belong to a union. And the union says go on strike, and the employer says don't. Which one is your authority? I'm not here to answer those questions today. I've had to answer them for myself at times. But, submission. Do you have a heart of submission? If you have a heart of submission, you're going to try to figure out what does God want you to do? Which authority has God placed you under? And then there's mothers and fathers, and they always agree about everything, right? And so if mother says one thing and father says another, which one are you supposed to submit to? And then throw into the mix broken homes and step parents and submission is difficult. And sometimes human authorities are in conflict with God's authority, direct things God has said. And how do we deal with that? Rebellion against God is never right. And we're to have a heart of submission. We like to rebel. If we are given a choice, we'll look for opportunities to rebel. Maybe not outwardly, but, inwardly. And here we're told that those straw man reasons we create in our minds to justify our rebellion is a lack of submission against God. And it's rebellion against God. This brings us to our third clarification. It has to do with this whole attitude of submission. In verse 5, it says it's necessary to be in subjection to human authorities, not only because of wrath. Sometimes if you disobey mom and dad, you're going to get it whack, 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 right? If you disobey the government, they're going to send the IRS after you, or put you in prison, or put you to death, or whatever the case may be. There's wrath. There's consequences for disobeying human authority. But there's also our conscience toward God. Rebelling against authority is rebelling against God. A child who disobeys a parent is rebelling against God. You've got to teach your kids this. When you disobey me, you're disobeying God. They got to understand that. Because they got to understand that you're accountable to God too. And if I don't take care of you in the way God says, then I'm disobeying God. I'm under authority and you're under authority, and God expects me to submit and He expects you to submit. A citizen that disobeys the government is rebelling against God. A wife who rebels against her husband is rebelling against God. A husband who fails to obey God is rebelling against God. An employee who rebels against his boss is rebelling against God. Now, what about Jesus? God in human flesh, on this earth, walking on this earth, did He submit to human authority? Remember when He was before Pilate? Pilate says, "Don't you give me an answer? Don't you realize I have authority to put you to death or to release you?" What did Jesus say? Did Jesus say, "You don't have any stinking authority, don't you know who I am"? Is that what He said? No, Jesus said, "You have authority, He didn't say those words, but he said, you would have no authority if not given to you from on high. And so here is God in human flesh, acknowledging that he was under Pilate's authority as a man, but that authority came from God. And Jesus is our example. Flip over to 1 Peter chapter 2. At the end of 1 Peter chapter 2, as we go into chapter 3, it says, you wives in the same way, likewise be submissive to your own husbands. What's he in the same way about? Well, if you get down to verse 7, it says, husbands likewise. So, likewise, like the wise, wives like something else. If you go back up to verse 13, it says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Verse 15, for such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are twisted, perverse, unreasonable. And so he says that submission is not dependent upon them doing what is right or them being good, but you're required to submit for the sake of your relationship with God, even when they are perverse, twisted. Verse 21, for you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example to follow in his steps. So the example of submission is Jesus Christ. Leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps. While being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And so Jesus submitted to human authority, even though they were killing him, in submission to God. And so it's sandwiched between this command in general to be submissive, servants be submissive, wives be submissive, husbands be submissive to Christ, and so forth. Submission arises from humility. Submission arises from humility. And humility is seeing ourselves as we truly are. And we are where we are. We are where God has placed us. We are under authority where God has placed over us. And we are in submission because God has put us. You know, if God wanted you to be the President of the United States, you would be. If God wanted you to be the boss, you would be. God could put you in any position of authority if he chose, but he hasn't. He's chosen to put you where you are for his reasons, and it is our duty and responsibility to recognize God has put me here, put them there. This is my duty and responsibility to them because of my duty and responsibility to God. Submission is good. It arises from humility. Pride is an overestimation of who we are. That person is not qualified. I'm more qualified. I should be the boss. I can't be the boss, so I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do this. And we rebel because we think we should be in a different position than where God has put us. Who's right, us or God? Well, that's not a hard one to answer, but maybe it's a hard one to say, right? So submission is good, and God puts us in a place that he wants us to be, and he puts authority over us, and there's no authority except that which belongs or comes from God. And humility is accepting where we are and responding out of our submission to God to those in authority over us. We have to look beyond them to God in order to function properly. And you know, it's good for us in a lot of ways to submit. Now, submitting doesn't solve all problems in our lives. It didn't solve all Jesus' problems, right? It didn't deliver him from trouble. There'll still be trials and troubles. But submission reduces life's conflicts. First of all, submission to God brings peace with God. Romans chapter 5 puts it this way, therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God. And when we recognize that we're sinful and that we're separated from God because of our sin and because of Adam's sin, and we submit to Him, and we put our faith and trust in Jesus, somebody says there's many ways to God. All roads lead to God, many ways. I'll just go this road instead of the way God says. Wait, where's the submission into that? Submission includes recognizing that God says this is salvation and there's no salvation in any other way. That's submission, isn't it? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And we say, well, okay, that's fine, but I'm going to go this way and I'm sure I'm going to get... Wait a minute. You're rebelling against God. If you think that you're going to earn your way to heaven by your own good works and God says no, you're rebelling against God. You see, it's insidious. It's just there. It's present everywhere. This rebelliousness. And so in salvation is submitting to God. And what's the result of that? Blessed be the God and Father who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in heavenly places. All the blessings associated with salvation are the result of submission to God. If you don't submit to God, you're not saved. And if you're not saved, you're going to spend eternity separated from God in a place called the lake of fire. Okay, maybe it's something we should think about if we don't have a right relationship with God, right? Submission is good for us. And not only does it bring peace with God, but it brings a measure of peace with those in authority over us. Right? If we have a heart of submission and we act in submissiveness to those in authority over us, things will generally go better. Not always, right? But generally, if you're not flying in the face of your boss, you're probably going to get along. I remember I was in Africa and a group of women had asked for us to have a session with them, me and Steve Van Horn. And so it was a question and answer session. And the women asked, and this is a very real question for them, how should we respond when our husbands beat us? And we talked about the issues there and talked about the church's responsibility. And then I says, but I want to ask you a question. And I want you to think about this. How many of your husbands beat you when you obey this verse to be quiet and submissive? And how many of them are hitting you whenever you're yapping in their face? And you know what happened? The whole room burst into laughter. Because they understood that although it was wrong, and we had made it very clear, it was wrong for their husbands to beat them, I also wanted them to understand that their lack of submission was creating an occasion for which it was happening. I'm not advocating that anyone beat anyone, all right? Understand me here. But what I'm saying, and the point is, that our lack of submission brings many of our own troubles on our own heads. And if we submit, it often goes much better for us. And that's the point I'm trying to make. And then there's this whole issue of inner peace. That, when we rebel, it tastes sweet in our mouth, but in our stomach it turns to gravel if we're a Christian. Right? That it's like, I feel so good. And then it's like, shouldn't have done that. Right? And we begin to look at the consequences and we begin to realize, oh man, I dishonor God in this. And that even if nobody ever finds out, it eats at us. And so the result of submission is peace with God, peace in our heart, a degree of peace with other people. And it's good for us. And that's what he says here, for conscience sake, because of our conscience towards God, we should submit, and submission is good for us. There's no authority that exists except God. And submission is good because of that. And that's the kind of world that we live in. I don't like it. In some ways I don't like it. I don't like some of the people that are in authority over me, and I don't think they do what's right, and I don't think God thinks they do what's right. But God has put me where He's put me, and it's my responsibility to look to Him and submit to Him and those He places in authority over me to the fullest of my ability. And only when there's a conflict from what God directly says and they're telling me to do, that I must obey God rather than them. And I need to be careful to guard my heart that I don't take their wrongness and make an excuse for my rebellion, because then I'm wrong too. Shall we pray? Father, thank you for your word. Lord, you know our struggles. You know the struggles of our heart, and maybe even some of us are struggling right now that the pastor would say such things. I don't know. You know. Father, just pray that you would take your word and touch our lives, that you would give us a humble submissiveness, first of all, to you. Give us the ability to see that we live in a world where there's no authority except from you, and help us to have a heart that desires to please you, and a desire to have peace with you and those around us, so that we might live in peace and be able to share your love with those around us for your glory. Father, bless our lives. Bless us with hearts of submission, that we might be blessing to those around us, that you might be honored. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.